Allan, welcome to BizJet TV. For those of you that are watching for the first time, we've got Allan Baker here from New Zealand with us today, and we're going to be touching on the subject of pilots' health and wellness, insomnia, fatigue, and all this interesting question. Now, Allan is a retired Royal Air New Zealand Air Force pilot, registered psychologist. He's also the Jim Collins Memorial Award holder for his outstanding contributions to aviation safety in New Zealand aviation industry. Further, he's also the author of Bliss for Insomniacs, a great book that provides a detailed treatment that is also developed to help insomniacs and aviation professionals with sleep disorders and sleep problems to actively bring on sleep. So we're going to be talking about sleep today and safety in that. So, Allan, what trends have you noticed in the last 10 years regarding pilots and sleep disorders?
Oh, that's interesting. A number of things have piqued my interest. Among those have been developments in the science related to essentially back of the clock wakefulness or operation. Okay. And an enormous amount of research coming out now as to just how dangerous to short, medium, long-term health it is if you're working between 1 a.m. in the morning and 5 a.m. in the morning, and there's just no getting away from it. We really don't know how to mitigate the effects of that, and we probably can't. Why? Because human beings didn't evolve to stay awake and work during those hours, and so we actually pay a huge price. So I think that's one of the things, and a correlate with that, of course, is the emergence of aircraft with amazing ranges without refueling, and so the ability to fly 18 hours on the or more on the trot. And how do you do that? And how do you do that safely? Initially, how do you do that within the framework of flight duty hours, which is essentially say, well, like a judge does, you'll start at 13 hours, but then we might let you out a bit, or we might take a bit away under the circumstances. So,
the thing is, with the airlines, you're constantly going to be rostered to do that kind of thing. With a private jet, you may do a long 18-hour flight once a year, which is manageable. But if you're doing that every couple of weeks or every week, then that's going to add up. And
sure. And I do wonder about, the pressure on you where you've got a very intimate relationship with your employer. How do you push back? The need to, the incentivization to go, well, it's only this one trip, and so I'll fit it in, and that is probably okay if you've got the normal fatigue mitigation abilities. That what we're really looking at, I think, in terms of long-term health, is in fact within the airlines, where a substantial amount of your duties are actually between that 1 a.m. and 7 a.m. and adding in time zones on top of that, and you've actually got a cocktail of very dangerous circumstances.
It's not easy. It's not easy. So do you think so basically over the last 10 years we've seen a lot more longer flights? I mean, even now in the private jet space, they're building airplanes with more range. And I criticize the manufacturers for that, because I said, we need more speed. We don't need more range. Elon Musk has said more than once, he said, we're going to use my rockets to fly from anywhere to anywhere in less than an hour on this planet. Now, that would solve the long distance travel, because if we take, for example, when William Shatner, the actor that played Captain Kirk, went up to space a few months ago, they could have easily landed back down in New Zealand instead of landing back down in Texas. And so, it would have taken half an hour to go from Texas to New Zealand on a rocket. So you imagine putting people on a rocket, and we've proven that a 90-year-old can do it. So, that's probably the way forward. Yeah, I think that's the way forward. And it would solve the issue of the pilots flying all those hours or staying awake. Now, some airlines are rostering pilots to fly 900 hours a year, which is the maximum you can fly as a pilot at the controls. And then another 400 or 500 hours, you're in the bunks at the back, having a sleep. So they'll take off with one set of crew flying. They'll fly for 3 or 4 hours, and then another crew will relieve them while the crew that did the takeoff will go back and sleep for 6-7 hours and then come back to do the landing. But they're still sleeping on an airplane. What's sleep like on an airplane compared to on the ground, Allan? Is it the same?
Well, no, it's substantially different. And you know, where do you start? The atmosphere at 8,000 feet or in a 787 is slightly lower, thank goodness.
Yeah,
but
it is, yes.
you know, the efficacy of being able to work those longer hours or have those longer duty hours is actually predicated on being able to take restorative sleep while you're in the bunk. Now, we don't know a hell of a lot about the quality of sleep in the bunk, but I mean, here's a tiny trivial fact. The first time sleeping in any strange space is actually going to guarantee that you're going to have very poor sleep. Why is that? Well, because our vigilance goes up, and it takes a night or at least a night in a hotel room to get used to the fact that you're in a different space. So we know the first time that you sleep in a different space, your vigilance remains very high. Yeah. And so I would strongly suspect that although you may be allocated 6-7 hours in the bunk, the quality of sleep during that time means that it would be equivalent to 2-3 hours, you know, back home. You know, it's that's actually recognized in sophisticated fatigue risk management systems. You know, we don't actually trade 1 hour in the bunk for 1 hour on duty. It's actually, we have some formulas for that. However, yeah, the long-winded answer to your question is, yeah, bunk time is terrible.
Yeah. Now, in your studies, you mentioned a high percentage of pilots die within 5 years of retirement. How does sleep play into this quite alarming statistic?
Well, let me just backpedal a little bit. That number, which indicates that, you know, from actuarial studies, you know, how long do pilots live after retirement? Very controversial. In fact, I haven't read or looked at a really good study that gives me confidence to say that pilots overall have a shorter lifespan after a career of flying. We simply really don't know. But I think the important thing is this. What we do know is that broken shifts, working and having duty times when most of the world is sleeping, in other words, between 1 a.m. and 7 a.m. in the morning, is very bad for our long-term health, and particularly connected with the so-called metabolic disorders. What's that? Anything to do with our metabolism, aka diabetes, inflammatory problems, and the like. So I think what we can say, even if that statistic that pilots die younger than the general population, which is a tough one. I think it needs a lot more work. Yeah. But notwithstanding that, the science is now emerging that anyone who is consistently working during those small hours can expect to have deleterious effects on their health, which will probably add up to shortening their lifespan. I think that's the most conservative approach, but it's still very bloody alarming.
Yes, it is. It's... Now, most people watching this have their own private jet or they're thinking of buying one. What recommendation would you give to them in order to keep their pilots rested enough and healthy in that? Because the last thing someone wants to do is their pilot to drop dead in the hotel or alternatively on the flight deck while they're flying them on a business trip. I mean, what should someone do that's looking to buy a private jet pilot-wise?
Yeah. I think to be cognizant of the fact that you can put your pilots under a very high level of pressure simply because of that intimate relationship that you have as the employer, the colleague, the person you're flying with, the person that you're sharing the space with. And to be aware of that dynamic, because you may have business pressures which require or put a huge amount of pressure on you to be in a certain place at a certain time. That's fine if you want to take that risk in the quality of your negotiations and your ability to do your job. But putting your pilot under that level of pressure is actually not a smart thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, and it also can be very, very dangerous. Now, in your book, you developed a system to help people to cope with insomnia problems and getting that quality sleep, which you've been talking about, which is really, really important. Can you explain to us how this system works and what someone can do to sort of mitigate this type of problem?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me just give you a tiny little bit of background. I'm an aviation psychologist, right?
Yeah.
I help my clients, and the bottom line is that I help them with their performance. Okay, about 5, maybe 10 years ago, I had a number of referrals from the New Zealand Airlines with pilots who just couldn't hack the time zone changes. And flying from New Zealand, you're pretty much going to get those no matter where you fly to, or you don't go vertically except into lots and lots of ocean. So I was employed to help these pilots who were not adjusting well to long haul flying. And to be honest, when I looked in my kit bag of tools that were available for psychologists and medics to treat people with insomnia, I was embarrassed. Okay. And then I looked at the literature and I found a huge disconnect between the good literature on sleep, and particularly around the onset of sleep. What actually happens as we move from wakefulness to full sleepiness. And I looked at the hints and the tips and the books written in the area, and they were just nonsense. And I was embarrassed. And so I looked at things like conventional advice. Conventional advice is, don't look at your laptop, if you expect to be able to go to sleep. And yet, there's not a shred of science behind that. I looked at some of the medications, advice around, say, the efficacy of melatonin. And pilots were taking melatonin as they would take a hypnotic. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you take a hypnotic because it mimics the neurophysiological chemical state in the brain, aka around sleep, and you're some way towards achieving sleep. But melatonin doesn't do that. Melatonin is like a traffic light that says, oh, it's green, you can go to sleep, it's red, you need to stay awake. It in itself is only a signal. And so the idea of taking melatonin at 3 o'clock in the morning to get back to sleep is just bonkers. Other advice, this is the one I love the best, is, retain the bedroom for sex and sleep. And I thought, what about the Scottish who all bundle into the same bed and call it bundling? Or people who sleep in yurts, where they only have one room. And I thought, this is nonsense. When your eyes are closed, how the hell do you know where you are anyway? So I'm being a bit trivial and a bit silly here. But what it prompted me to do was to get some very serious study going, my own study around this business of the transition from wakefulness to sleepiness and what actually happens. And so what I did, through the assistance of a guy called Allan at Harvard, very old now, he must be 105. But Allan was brilliant in that he came up with a 3-factor model of consciousness. And he said there's a neurochemical aspect, right? Which is largely predicated by the sleep hygiene people. There's this shift from awareness and concentration and being in the external world to being in the internal world. So there's a little gating function that works in the thalamus when we actually go off to sleep. And what we have to do is create the conditions for that gate to work. And we switched off from stimulation from the outside world. with the exception of the sense of smell, interestingly enough. And the third aspect was complete, and I call it the third leg of the stool, but it was completely ignored. And that is, how do you affect the brain to make that transition from an EEG state of what we call alpha, which you and I are presumably in now, into states of theta and delta, which are very slow wave sleep, slow wave cycles. And so I then began to look at how through mental gymnastics, if you could call it that way, in other words, the way that we train our thinking and concentration, to see if in fact we could induce this state of delta from the chaotic state of alpha, and actually found that we can do it. The fascinating thing that comes out of that is that sleep and taking sleep moves from being something that happens when you remove all the obstacles, right? Into being something that you can actively do. And that seems like a paradoxical state, because how do you actively do something to create a state which is inactive? However, if you create a skill which dramatically increases the probability that the brain will take sleep, then I think you've created an active state to bring on sleep. So I called it bilateral induced sleep. It fitted nicely with the acronym BLISS, and I've refined it now. Initially, I depended a lot on control of eye movement. I no longer think that that's particularly necessary, but I think the synchronicity of the bilateral business actually helps the brain move from a state of wakefulness into that state of sleep. I'll just say one tiny thing in there. One of the reasons why we have so much myth, I believe, around how we go to sleep, and one of the major myths is that you have to be calm, or you have to have a calm mind to go to sleep. Now, that's really important for pilots, because they come out of a hugely stimulating environment.
I mean, I found when I was doing flights, like finish a flight at 12 o'clock at night, when I got home, my brain was still going. For at least an hour and a half, and I just couldn't sleep because my brain was, because of the speed of the airplane. Your mind's moving so fast, and it takes time to sort of calm that mind down.
I wish I talked to you, because I can now speed that up. And I speed it up because the important variable, believe it or not, in here is not one of whether your brain is busy or not. It's a question of vigilance. So it's what it's busy on. And if it's busy on maintaining your safety, or believing that you need to be awake or vigilant because the world is still dangerous, then you won't sleep. But you can have a mind which is magnificently busy, but as long as it's not busy on vigilance. So I typically go off to sleep working on a whole manner of problems, but I'm okay with those problems because I know that if I don't solve them, I'm going to be in no danger.
Makes sense.
So one of the other areas that I rail against is the stupidity of CBT, what's called CBTI. Those merchants put themselves out there saying, "Oh, this is the gold standard." That's crap. I'll probably get deregistered and defrocked for saying that. But it's crap. They're missing the point.
You mean cognitive behavioral therapy?
Absolutely and utterly missed the point. One of my favorite books is one of the popular texts in this area, and it's entitled "Calm Your Mind and Go to Sleep." That's nonsense. You don't have to calm your mind to go to sleep, which should be of great relief to people.
That's actually true. So what do you need to do then in order to sleep?
Firstly, there are a number of things. Physiologically, it helps if you've been up for 14 hours. Why? Because the mix of neurochemicals are now going to induce sleep. That's as long as you don't get in the road of them. So if you take caffeine within an hour of going to bed, you'll get on the road of them. Okay. By the way, I need to add in here also a huge amount of nonsense around diet and sleep. Now, why do I say it's nonsense? Because the brain actually is magnificently insulated from most of the chemicals that we take when we eat, and it's called the blood-brain barrier, and very little gets through. Yeah, diet probably has very little to it. Yeah, it probably helps to eat carbohydrates versus proteins, but it's marginal.
Yeah, but you should be eating half an hour before going to bed, should you? Should try and keep away from...
we should have our major meal at midday, and eat very sparsely. But the point I'm making here is that diet will have a little influence on whether sleepiness will prevail, but it's minor. The second area is so don't destroy what the brain wants to do after 14 hours is basically what I'm saying there. The second area is to do with your mental state, and it's not to do with relaxation, it's to do with vigilance, and safety. Hence, so the first night in a strange bed, you don't feel that safe. Second night, you do feel safe because you've got one night under your belt, right? So sitting in the bunk or lying in the bunk, going through the intertropical convergence zone at 3 a.m. in the morning, getting thrashed about, takes a little bit of getting used to. I've got 777 captains at one of the airlines that I work for that will not bunk while they fly through the equator. They go, the only place for me is up front, sunshine, during this time. I don't care that the bunk's available. And it's a good example of how, captain's duties or preferences interfere with fatigue risk management. They go, well, Captain, you're rostered to be asleep. I don't give a bugger. No way I'm going to sleep while we're getting thrashed about with QNIMs going to 50,000 feet. It just, and would you do that?
No, I agree. Yeah.
No, okay. So major area to get to grips with, and I deal with this quite well in the book, but I've written a lot about it subsequently. Is a revision of CBT, cognitive behavior therapy at least, but oriented around vigilance and how you get yourself into that state. And relaxation is an interesting thing. Relaxation helps, but only because relaxation tells the brain that you're safe. It isn't relaxation per se. Get up? And now, one of the reasons for this, you can analyze yourself as to whether you need to be vigilant or not, and change that state, which should come as great relief to people versus the trying to achieve calm, because that's very, very difficult to do. We're not really equipped to induce calm. Okay. Now, Buddhists do it after 40 years of training, and by then it's too late because they die anyway. But it's much easier to shift your orientation to one of vigilance and relaxation versus calmness. And the third area is, which I call the third leg of the stool, which is creating. It's sort of like a mantra, but I don't want to say that because that sounds quasi-religious or new agey. But it's a rhythm of bilateral stimulation, internally induced. So here's another point of contrast. A lot of people attempt to listen to stuff, calming music, soothing voices, soporific sounds, the sounds of the Everglades at dusk or whatever. But there's an essential conflict in there, because if you're actively listening, you've got to be vigilant, right? And vigilance goes against, you can't have it both ways. If you go, this is an interesting story, well, you've got to be awake to hear it. So you're setting up a conflict. And if you're not awake to hear it, and you go, oh, look, I'm just happy to have it as background noise or background sounds which are soothing, then your mind is free to wander. And it can well wander off into areas where, which is the antithesis of getting to sleep. So you have to be able to do something, and this is what I've created, which is completely absorbing, which is sleep compatible, which is non-threatening to vigilance, that induces a shift from our EEG from alpha states into the slow wave state of delta or theta. Now, just how that happens, no one is actually clear about. The idea of entrainment has been around for quite some time, where it says, if the brain gets into a particular rhythm, then you can move from that somatic stimulation or even auditory stimulation, as long as it's internally generated, not externally. Putting on headphones listening is not going to do it. You need to generate those sounds internally, but they need to move from side to side, and you get into that rhythm, and then the brain picks that up, and it actually makes that transition through to from the chaotic state of alpha through to delta. The thing about it is that it takes a bit of practice, okay? But once you do it, your confidence of being able to take sleep goes through the roof. And my own experience is that I quite often wake up during the night. I get up, have a glass of water. I call it resetting. I go back to bed, and then I actually make this decision, which is, do I really want to be awake now? And sometimes I do, because I've got a really interesting problem that I really want to think about. Okay, but when I make that decision, I finally say, no, I've had enough now. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. I am now going to sleep. I know that I will be asleep within 5 minutes of starting. And that confidence is magnificent. It's worth the price of admission alone. That's one of my mentors used to say to me.
So basically you close, what do you do? What do you physically do? You lay down on the bed, you close your eyes, and then you start this rhythm.
Yeah, and I lie in such a way, and I encourage lots of my clients to do this in such a way as to be able to squeeze your thumb and forefingers together, left and right, and you do that to a synchronicity of 1 or 2 hertz, which is 30.
What you do this, do you?
Yeah. But only one at a time, because you're trying to get up.
One at a time.
Exactly. So
that's kind of the rhythm.
Yeah. So sometimes I'll go 21, 22, 23. See, I've gone.
Yeah.
And there are variations when you become more sophisticated. I advocate slowing down. Interesting,
one thing I found which is useful is walking on the ground barefoot, whether it's grass or whether it's sand. Having a walk for 10 minutes when you get off the airplane kind of grounds you. I found that personally helped me. I mean, I'd come back from a flight and get home maybe at 12:30, 1 o'clock at night, and I'd take my shoes off and go for a walk on the grass in the garden for like 5-10 minutes. And I found that would calm my mind to the point that, I could then get to sleep quicker than, I mean, I'm not saying it sent me to sleep instantly, but it certainly helped.
Gosh, with the 3 dogs living in your household, I'd be bloody wary about walking around outside.
Yeah, you've got to be careful. Yes, of course.
I know that's really interesting. I need to think about that. Maybe it's correlate a weird way of actually telling your brain that things are different now. You're really safe. you can, you know, I'm not the person to say this, but of course, going to sleep is like a little death. You know, it takes a little bit of courage. Woody Allen, who was interviewed about dying, said he wasn't afraid of dying, but he just didn't want to be there when it happened. And, we need to, I sometimes pose the question to people to say, if you really did have this ability to flick a switch and know that you'd go from consciousness to sleep, would you actually do it? Or would you be scared of doing it, And we get away with it because there's actually 20 minutes of transition from wakefulness to sleepiness where the ability to lay down memory is pretty much suspended. So, but we don't know that, and therefore we make it up to ourselves what we believe happened in that 20 minutes. But in fact, we're in a state much the same as people with dementia. Complete inability to remember anything that happened in that 20 minutes, which is actually a good thing, because if we were fully awake and had our memory intact, a lot of us would resist going off to sleep the same way as you resist fainting. It's a big surrender. To go, I'm happy for the next 5 hours to be out of it, to be vulnerable, to be able to defend myself. So, it pays not to think too much about our vulnerability when we're asleep.
Yeah, of course. So, Allan, where can people get your book Bliss?
Yes, well, it's online through Gumroad. And so the easiest
we'll post a link below.
And I was able to find the domain mysleepswitch.com. So just all one word, mysleepswitch.com, and work it from there. Now that means that you get it in PDF form. But it's also published in the United States through Lulu Books.
Oh, okay, good. So mysleepswitch.com, that's good. Okay. So that's how people can find out about your book and about your services, which is good. So do you finding more pilots contacting you now than over the last few years? I mean, is this becoming more and more a problem?
Well, I think it's always been a problem. In terms of pilots' awareness, I mean, the new generation of young pilots coming through, I find are hugely attentive to issues that older pilots just used to say, well, we just got to suck it up.
Of course.
So I've got, I set up the New Zealand's Peer Assistance Network a few years before it became mandatory in Europe. And within the pilot peer group, I've got quite a number of young, super smart pilots who are doing some really interesting work, ranging from nutrition and the impact. The impact of crappy airline meals is they're not optimized for.
Oh no, I've been through that myself. I mean, I got towards the end of my airline pilot career. What we were doing is I was bringing meal from home. And when I was down route, I'd go to the supermarket, I'd buy my stuff, prepare my own thing and take it with me. Because just, what people don't realize is that meals on airplanes are cooked a month before and then put in the freezer. So by the time they land on your plate on the airplane, the nutritional value is like almost zero, which is okay if you fly once a month. But if you're a pilot and you're flying 3 or 4 times a week, and during those 3 or 4 times a week, you're flying 2 or 3 flights a day, you're eating those meals all the time. So, it's going to have a toll on your health. So I just thought, screw that. I'll just take my own food.
And that's, I've got a number of pilots who are doing that. But, to answer your question, I find that the awareness of the whole deal. And while most of them are besotted by flying, are thrilled to actually have an airline job. On the other hand, they're also carrying with them a greater appreciation of risk to themselves that wasn't there 30, 40 years ago, I'm sure. I mean, I can think of the things I did in the Air Force. Absolute shockers that we just wouldn't go near today.
Well, Allan, thank you very much for being on BizJet TV. We'll get everybody to get your book, which is really, really interesting. And this is a problem that people need to deal with. Pilots and owners of airplanes have to realize that pilots need to sleep and need to get adequate rest so that they can perform well when they're flying around on business. Especially when emergencies happen or bad weather. They know how to cope with these things. They're vigilant enough. They're awake. They're with it. They can perform at their best. It's really, really important. And those of you that haven't subscribed to BizJet TV, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. Get the commentary going below. I'd like to hear what you think of what Allan and I have been talking about here today about sleep and pilots and that. And that's all from us here on BizJet TV. And we'll see you on the next one.